Yeah, so thank you for joining us. Monika, who's going to lead the session, has been an iOS developer for over 8 years and currently works as a senior staff engineer at ChargePoint. She has worked in different kinds of teams, from being the sole iOS developer in a company of 10 to a group of 12 iOS developers. She enjoys taking an idea from rough inception to final production deployment, and she still loves coding after so many years and is really thankful about that. And with that, it's all yours.
Yeah, it varies day to day, but yeah, most days I'm happy coding. I think we talked about going over the exercises in chapter 8. Do you guys still want to do that? And does anyone want to share their exercise, for that chapter? Any volunteering? Farhana, you're so quiet. You like to.
Hey, yeah, I'm just pulling it up. I'm down to go over. Yeah, let me pull up the exercise 1, implement password length requirements. Okay. So
and that was a good one. Like, how do you add like another mapping, basically, operator to your stuff? You want to share and show us how you did it?
Yeah, definitely. I think what definitely helped was I think last session you pointed out that there's a combine latest 4, 3. That really helped. So I was like, how do I combine 2 and then 2 again? And
yes, that would have made it, I don't know, that would have made it very complicated.
Let's see, pulling up Xcode and share my screen. Okay, this should be it. Just gonna share. I think this is what I have. Let me see repos. This one, chapter.
It's chapter 8.
Okay. So then which file was I working on? Sign up form. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. I try to
You were trying to change it for the,
for exercise 3, I think, something like that. And then I think I wrote comments on where, there we go. Okay. So the requirement was, verify that the password count is at least 8 characters. So I made the publisher, mapped it, only return it if it's greater than 8 or equal to 8. And then here it's used, do I use it more? Okay, yeah, I used it a bunch of times. So I think I first check it, 64, let me see. Okay, yeah, I define it here, and then I use it in the is valid publisher to combine 3, verify the length, the strength, and matching. And then I also do it here. Oh, this is where we do the message verifier thing. First, so we get the length back in the callback and return the message we want to display to the user, assign it here, and yeah, and I use it again here. It's weird to me to I have to use this in so many places. I do want to use it in just one place because I feel like the maintenance gets crazy after if you keep adding more functionality.
And I think, because here we were using assign, so it seemed like we were assigning it. The other way is to do a sync and then do multiple things at the same time. That's possible too. That way, you're basically, subscribing to this publisher, but you'll, you'll use it for more than one thing.
Yeah.
But I mean,
definitely.
this is valid. Yeah, this just gets a little tedious, I guess, when you're doing it to.
Monika, did you say sync?
Yeah,
Sync or store? Sync? Sorry.
sync I think sync is also a
Oh,
way to-
like that sync. Oh, okay.
yeah, sorry, sync
I
like
was-
dot sync. Yeah,
I
sorry.
was doing async and sync these days.
Oh yeah. Unfortunately, English language is kind of a sync as like a bathroom sink.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point. I think one thing I want to try is like making this.
I mean, it's
more
nice
better.
that for certain things it makes sense that you would just do a sign because you're doing this, you're subscribing to some event, and the result of that event is gonna be changing one of your attributes or properties. But I think if it's like a multiple things, then it might make sense to
Mhm.
to do that. Yeah. And
Yeah, that's
then
a great point.
the other thing I sort of found out that, we did notice that, which I thought was like, kind of looks bad, is that when we first load up the sign up form, it kind of shows these error messages because
Yeah.
initially the initial value of these fields is like, an empty string, and we're checking for this length. So a way to fix that is with all these publishers, you can drop the first result. So is this dot, so you can do it like this dot drop first before you do the dot map. And that, kind of fixes, so you try,
To count, I think. Drop first.
And I think by default count is just one. Yeah, if you just do it open and close break without even a passing account.
Oh, so default will be one. Nice.
Yeah, and it's kind of count, I think, is by default, like if you don't pass anything, it assumes like, so that makes it nice. And then similar thing for that color thing, we could, instead of like red like he had it, we could set it to clear and then have it that, when and then drop first at, the strength validator, and then as, because that was kind of bugging me. But overall, I think, he's kind of trying. This is a good example. And later on, he kind of builds on that for the networking that, he's using, Combine for the validation, because once you get networking, then that makes sense. But without networking, it seems like, oh, it would be a lot simpler to just have these as states of the, the view, and then you just have, some condition on the state to turn on and off something, right? And if the state changes, like someone types in username, that username is going to change, right? So then, whether it displays that message or not, So I guess what I'm saying is combine is not necessary unless, we're also using it for like, networking or something like that.
We can also filter it on not empty. So after
You could do that. Anyone else, like with the exercise for chapter, were there any questions or anything that kind of, made you wonder like how this works before we kind of move on?
Actually, hi everybody. This is actually my first session. So It's great to virtually meet everybody. I was just wondering, are the prior sessions recorded? Because I'm starting from the first chapter.
Yes, they are recorded and they're on the YouTube channel.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, Navati can, I guess we have, I think every time if you look, if you're part of that iOS study circle, I think Navati does post the recordings there. So there, if you go and look in the Slack, you see all the sessions.
Okay, sounds
So
good.
you can
Thank you
kind
so
of
much.
follow. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Any other kind of issues with this? You know, and then when Peter comes next week, we can kind of ask him some questions about, like, you know, any sort of, like, there are some, you know, it is a little harder sometimes to manage the to debug this, or it gets, as you know, most for Hannah found out, like, it just gets a little complicated in terms of, like, how many of these do you have to, like, what's the best way to, like, subscribe to things, so we're not kind of repeating things over and over. But I think so for chapter 9, you guys can see my screen, right? You know, this networking with Combine is where I think it does kind of show its power, just because, you know, and in the chapter, it kind of first goes like, you know, what's the traditional way of fetching data using URL session. And it's funny because I do this like every day. There's like, and I had to just change a bunch of stuff in our code. So, you know, this is something we're all familiar with, that, you know, you basically, you know, do the data task, you pass the URL, and then, you know, you're going to get a data response and error. And then just based on, you know, what the response is, you know, you're returning, and the way you return information through a closure. So here, like, you know, we're passing in the completion, whether, you know, it was a failure, or, you know, if there is, and all these places you're kind of going for different, like, okay, did we get data? No, then pass that. Then, you know, do the decoding. That itself can throw an error. So, you know, if it's, if you can actually decode, then, you know, pass that in the completion. And, you know, he kind of goes over what are some of the issues with, you know, this whole way of doing things is, and one is like, yeah, I mean, as he's saying, it's not clear what the happy path is, because there's like one path that where it's like actually returning success. Everything else, we're kind of dealing with these, you know, different kinds of errors and passing that. And, you know, and then the other thing is, like, I think we're all, especially if you've done iOS for a while and you've done asynchronous stuff, you know, people are used to completions, like, you know, closures and callbacks, but sometimes it would be nice if you could just make a call and just a return of that call is what you're looking, even though it's being done asynchronously. So, and then, as he was saying, error handling is all over the place, that you have to, like, you know, there's multiple places in that code that it's dealing with errors, and there's several exit points. And that one is also, I mean, I find sometimes when I'm writing this that it gets gnarly, like, you know, you have to check for so many things and make sure you're calling completion. If you forget, then you're not going to get the result. Yeah, and it's hard to read. And then, yeah, at the end, you know, you have to call, if you're using NSURL data, NSURL data tasks, then you have to make sure that, you know, you call resume on it a few times. When I first started, I was like, oh, I wrote this code and nothing's happening. And then I realized, oh yeah, because when I get that data task, I have to call resume on it. And, you know, some people actually like save those data tasks, or later they can cancel it. But anyways, it's that's kind of in, I think, a lot of iOS apps, you know, something gnarliest part of the code is the networking. Here's the, I was like looking for, I somehow must have missed this when he put this thing. when I ran Swift Run, then I had to like update my, so in his sample code, and I don't know if you guys actually ran the sample code, he's written a little Swift server so that, you know, when he's going to do this networking example, that he's basically hitting the server. And this is kind of, was everyone successful in running the server? Because yeah, I mean, the first time somehow my I had to set the Swift environment version, so I was like hung up about that for a little bit. It wasn't working because I've never used the Swift server, so it took a while to get that working. So, okay, so then, you know, the interesting thing is that because Combine is Apple's thing, that, you know, Apple has added these publishers for many of their own asynchronous APIs. So, you know, URL session now has a data task publisher, which is really nice. So he now shows in this sample code, you know, how how would a combined version of the code that we saw previously looks like. You know, and then, you know, at first we're checking for the URL, like if it's a valid URL, you know, if it, I mean, we'll continue. Otherwise, like, you know, we're just going to return false and do that erase to any publisher. And again, as we did the publishing stuff in the previous chapter, that any publisher is the better way to go. Because we don't want that typed publisher, because it gets kind of hard to read and complicated, and you don't always know exactly what's the final publisher after you're like sort of took a bunch of them and concatenated together what's the, you know, the final type. So this any publisher is the way, you know, we usually define, you know, what the returning publisher is. But anyhow, so, you know, you have this URL session, and then there's a data task publisher, and you pass a URL, and then in the result, you get a data and a response. And, you know, you're just basically here, you're trying to decode what that data is. And then if everything, the happy path is here, and then if for whatever reason there's any errors or anything, then you just return false. And this replace error is that, you know, any, you know, and he's going to get into detail more in the next chapter, but right now he's kind of ignoring returning error also as part of the results, which may not be great. So here, like this replace error, if at any point an error was thrown, we're just going to return false, because at the end, this publisher is just returning bool, and this never is basically saying that this doesn't fail, which realistically for, you know, things like networking is not maybe where we want to be, because there's times when we do want to display error and know exactly what the error was, but I guess that comes in the next chapter. But for this one, like any error happens, just, you know, replace it. Any question about at least this part where he shows how, you know, how you can convert the previous networking into a combined publisher?
I think initially I was confused about the data task publisher, like as to, you know, what is returning, and then I think he also does address this. There's an output associated with it, and that's why we get access to both data and response.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's basically mimicking what you would do anyhow if you were doing like the traditional data task, right? Because when you call that, you know, in the closure, we get data, response, error. And that's kind of the traditional, like anytime you're calling the data task method on URL session. So analogous to that, you know, the publisher also if you're, basically getting that, it will be returning this tuple, which is data and response. And, the map just kind of is your operator that does more massaging of that to finally give you the final type, which is just a Boolean, whether this, username is available or not. Yeah, and then I did catch that we do the same for errors that occur when accessing the network. This is like a simplification, so errors, he kind of doesn't deal with it. It's like, okay, if you catch an error, just, return it. And then he tries, the next part is that, he is just even more simplifying the call, that, at the end, we just care about, so the output, as we were mentioning, is really data and response. And in the publisher, you can actually map to a certain key path for that tuple. So you say, I'm only interested in the data part. So the result of that publisher, when it's, the output stream would be just the data part. And that kind of makes it a little cleaner, because then you're just like, oh, okay, I'm just getting the data. And then since the result is now just the data, now you can call decode on it. And then, basically decoding that to get your, the username available message. And then that itself will return you, the username available message object. And then you can, again, call an operator and just get the specific property from that, which is available. So then suddenly what we had previously, shrinks to even less code. A little, you still have to kind of get used to it, because, it's not so verbose. But, it's a lot cleaner and easier to read and see what is happening. Any questions about this, how that code previously became this? And, given that, we're all write a lot of networking code, there is something really nice about this, that, it can sort of simplify it to something like that. And here, what he does is, we're going to have a certain service, class. And one of the methods, there's authentication service. One method is this check username available, which is returning this publisher. And this publisher just does what we just went over previously. Yeah, and this is how you're saying it's a good idea, put it in a different class that just deals with those specific types of verification, but that's just kind of something you would have done no matter what, whether this was like Combine or whatever. You would probably have these services for the different sort of backend services that you call. And previously you would have, in this method, passed the callback, and you would have called your callback. Here, it's basically returning the publisher. And here, we go back to sort of, okay, now that we have that, how do we connect it to our UI? And this is kind of based on what previously in chapter 8 we're working on, where, we had this view model that had the Boolean that was whether it was valid or not, right? And then, it had that username message and is valid. And this got these two, were assigned values based on the publishers. And here, now we have, like, we had the other publishers, now we have this, the checked username available publisher. We're basically, again, for username, doing anytime that there is a change there, then, we're basically calling this check username available.
So I have a question, maybe it's silly, but why are we using flat map versus map in this case?
That's a good question. I think the reason for that is that if I think he wants to make sure that we just because is that because the type is changing, or it's just one value? That's a good question. Anybody else knows that?
Yeah,
I think
even I had that question.
Yeah.
Remember, for publishers, they stop publishing once there is an error, or
Yes.
it reaches an end. And we saw where errors could be published when network error happened. Then the publisher will stop publishing, and no matter what the user enters, it might stop, right? It might not continue to check. What flat map does is it creates a new publisher every time.
Oh, okay.
So it's mapping it onto a new publisher.
Interesting. Versus if I just did map, it would have stopped once and error was happening.
Yes, that's my guess. I have not tried it, but there was, I don't know where I read, probably another blog. If I find it, I can post it on the Slack channel.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is it somehow a publisher of publishers, like the nesting thing is?
Yeah, that's why it's flat.
Yeah.
Like if you take the other, its counterpart in functional programming, map and flat map.
Yeah.
So instead of creating arrays of arrays, if you say flat map, you'll just get one array.
It
right?
gets, it sort of flattens it to just one value rather than.
So instead of creating a publisher of a publisher, you just get one publisher.
Okay. So when we are accessing property wrappers and the publishers there, like, that means we would generally use flat map versus map. Is that what we would do? Or I'm just trying to figure out when to use which.
Here in this highlighted portion, check username available, that function returns a publisher, right?
Yes.
And you're still in that chain of publishers. So if your return value itself is a publisher.
Okay.
So you're, instead of returning a value like a bool or an int or a string, this function returns another publisher. So you're making it into, basically flattening it instead of creating a publisher of a publisher. So you'll basically, the output would be a bool in this case, instead of being a any publisher bool never.
Right. Because at the end of this, we want, just a
Boolean.
The Boolean. Because that's kind of, I see. Why?
Check username available returns a publisher.
Because if like, if this username was a publisher and we, kind of operate at the end, that would have returned a Boolean, you wouldn't need this. But the problem is that this itself, you're just calling this, that you want to make sure that, this is actually, it's not returning publisher because this is a publisher, but the result of the publisher.
Yes. So you can probably understand it by correlating it with its counterpart, right? Mapping an array or mapping an array of an array using flat map.
And I mean, he kind of shows it here that you have this, you call this, but but still. And a question to ask him.
Yeah. The error explanation I gave, I'm sorry, that's for try map. That gets even more complicated. But in this case, it is basically converting a publisher into a publisher.
Yes. So less about the error, more about that we want we want the final result of this.
Yeah.
So it kind of unwraps into that rather than giving us another publisher.
Yeah, TriMap gets a little bit more complicated. So you have a publisher, and then if you use a TriMap, it replaces that publisher into another publisher. It gets
Interesting.
complicated. But this one is
When
just
we would use that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. And yeah, and then here, basically it's back to like, creating that lazy var thing, except this one is for the username available publisher. And this thing, this was, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe, I mean, that seems kind of, that wouldn't be fun to actually define. So, and he does mention, you don't want to deal with the actual, resulting type, because, when you're sort of concatenating all these publishers together. So change it to be any publisher, and then just make sure that, again, you call this erase to any publisher so that it sort of, hides the specific type. And for someone who's just subscribing to that, it doesn't matter, right? As long as you're what the type that it's going to return is. And then this part, once you have that extra publisher, then it's a matter of like adding this, I think, it's key right now, just it is username available publisher and assign it to is valid. But realistically, if we go back to the chapter A, we'll be combining the results of all of these, right? Which we'll see later, because it's not just one, is valid is not only dependent on whether this username is available, but other results too. Okay, and then the next part, which I actually think is pretty important, is like running these publishers. How are you going to get, we know that for regular networking calls, we want to make sure that in those callbacks that we had, that we call the dispatch, a lot of us use the dispatch async on the main thread to make sure if we do any sort of like UI stuff, that we're not doing it on a separate thread that's not the main thread. So here, you can, when you receive, if you don't specify it, because it was basically using the iOS networking, it would be, the result will come from a separate thread, because the way iOS deals with these things, that these data tasks, they'll be basically running in a separate thread, and when they have the results, they'll be in that separate thread. But you want to make sure that, when you get the results and you're going to do other things with it, that you're getting that result on the main thread. So you would do this receive dispatch name, and that way you're guaranteed that anything else that, when, especially with the SwiftUI, if it's like, updating, because now everything is kind of based on these changes. So if like is valid changes on the submit button changes, all that will happen in the main thread. And were folks okay with this? I mean, it's not that complicated to put it there, but I wonder that if you don't do that, and then you can get these weird crashes sometimes based on whether, how it's going to take the results of these published, and when it's trying to update something in the UI, it might not be in the right thread. But the next part was pretty interesting too, because, you can imagine that now here you are like typing the username and any like character that you're typing in is just hitting, the server, and of course he's saying, well, if you're running the server locally, maybe not a big deal because it's just not going out anywhere. But if you're in a realistic scenario, you're going to have like a server out there, and you really don't want to call this constantly. Now let me see. Oh, there was like a there was a couple of things that I'm just remembering. So this was that, okay, so we've defined this publisher, and then we had it that in this case, oh, okay. So in this example, he was showing that, we have 2 calls to this publisher. So we have basically 2 subscribers. So you have this one that, it's updating is valid, and this one is updating username message. And the issue with that is that because there's 2 subscriptions, there's going to be actually two calls to the network when it's like up, is checking whether this username is available or not. Even though like username changes, you could imagine that, username changes, it's, whatever the result of that is should be shared amongst these 2 subscribers. But the way right now, Combine is, gets said that if you're taking that publisher and you subscribe 2 different times, then that in a way is creating like 2 instances of this publisher for checking. And that's, and here's where it's going, like the first subscriber is the pipeline that feeds the is valid. So there's 1 pipeline that way. And then you have another second subscriber, another pipeline that's getting the error message. So every time the user types a character, each pipeline needs to go and process the current value of the username. So in a way, it results in a separate call to the network. And, we don't want to do that because essentially they both they want to share the result of, this publisher. And the way he shows you can do that is that basically yet another special term is that, you do share. And then basically that's kind of telling the Combine framework that this is to be shared with anybody else, this publisher, anybody else subscribing to this publisher should share the results. You shouldn't create these different separate pipelines to get the values. And then the other interesting thing is, and this kind of comes back to like debugging this stuff, that's kind of a pain, that a lot of times, this .print is used so that you can exactly see on the console, like how many times, like what actually happens in the whole lifetime of this publisher. So it shows like, oh, it received the subscription, request unlimited, then it receives a value. And then this username is, whatever you put in print, it prepends those actual printouts with that and special key. So now, like, he's saying, oh, there's only 1 subscriber, is because, when at the time that it's getting that information, there is 1 subscription. But after the share, if you look at, printing out the share, then there is 2, it's kind of like multicasting, like it's receives this update, and then multicasting to whoever is subscribing to it, right? And the funny thing, and again, this is where sometimes the complexity of Combine comes, that, I would have thought, when I was doing it, that, oh, I have the same publisher. If I'm assigning, I'm just subscribing 2 different places, Combine is smart enough to just know it's the same publisher, right? So, it should just be giving the results to both. But that's not how it works. And I think this is one of the tricky things about Combine. So you have to be very careful to make sure to use the share. So you're kind of telling it, hey, and maybe there are cases where you might want to have different pipelines, maybe they slightly do different things. But in this case, it is kind of the same result. So you want to multicast to these different subscribers and not go and do the operation again. Does this make sense? Because I thought that was sort of a little complicated. I mean, once you know and you do it, it's fine. But I think it's easy to forget to do that. And then you're kind of, causing some performance issues here. And then I didn't see this, that he was saying, like, you'll find that for each, you will still see true request. But I wasn't totally, I didn't go and exactly check this. Did anyone else check to see if this was happening? He's basically saying, is share like actually works properly or not? But I didn't check that. The other important thing for this whole like performance for these operators is that, like, and this is and this actually happens even if you weren't doing Combine, that as I don't know how many of you in your apps you have like someone typing in, and as they're typing, and the sign up is a good example, is that you have to check, like, for username if it's valid or not. You don't want to be hitting, and that's when I first started talking about like performance, that you don't want, like, as the user types every letter, that you're just hitting the network. So this debounce call is used to make sure that you actually hit it after a certain, like, user types, you're not hitting until there's like a pause. And you can specify how long that pause is, and then go and hit the server. And that's really, really important, because otherwise you're just gonna, again, cause a lot of bottleneck for network calls. So it's a very nice sort of functionality that publishers have in Combine, that you can give it a specific constraint of when they actually start, so username, when you say debounce, like only when it stops changing after this time, then it hits the the next sort of operator, which is going and checking the user name availability in the network. And it could be anything else too, but sometimes you want to make sure that either that drop first is one kind of thing. I don't care about the first change, or this debounce, similar kind of things.
Even if like a user like hits a submit button continuously, even in that situation, you can avoid multiple calls being made, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Using debounce.
Actually, this even with regular, what a lot of times I've had to do is make the button, because sometimes what people do is the button's still enabled while it's making the network call, and you kind of want to make sure you disable it until the next change. Because people have, especially if the network call is kind of slow, people kind of feel like it didn't work. The submit button still showing, enable, so they keep hitting it, and then and then the other thing that actually just brings the other again, another thing to avoid certain, that is remove duplicates, and that would kind of address those kind of problems. Because if someone's like quickly, I mean, he's doing it in terms of like someone typed something and then went and did a backspace, and then it was back to the original call that we made. And if we already made that request, then it doesn't make sense to do that duplicate again. So that's yet another sort of a useful thing to to put in there to make sure that we're not, again, hitting the server. Yeah, and then the main thing is, remove duplicates or remove any duplicate events from the stream of events if they follow each other subsequently. And that's very useful too, because it goes back to like, people, they're constantly changing and you don't necessarily want to go and make that call. So that was the one he showed, like, type this, and then, you're going and making your request, and then you put an S and then your backspace. So then the last call was, the same, request anyway, so it's not gonna go and hit it again, which is useful. Yeah, and then he kind of put it all together where, now we have the full implementation of, what we had before and how this kind of got added. So any question for this? So, next week, Peter will be here. What I would suggest is that you guys tackle the exercise. I actually haven't finished both of them, but tackle the exercise, and also like maybe note down any questions that you would like to ask him, because this is like, he's actually worked with us and, knowledgeable, like anything that you think would be nice to like get more clarity. This is like a perfect opportunity while he's going to be with us.
Yeah, and I think the current plan is that he will probably, go over a presentation, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, and we can ask all
That
these
would be
questions.
perfect. Because I have a whole bunch of questions too, but it's just good. I mean,
Yeah.
I see the power, but you also, there is,
Yeah.
with simplicity, sometimes other things have, there's a lot more knowledge that you have to have. And
Yeah.
one question I'm going to ask, like, have you used it in a more, like, where have you found it very useful, or you've actually implemented it? So,
Yeah.
to see what, his perspective is. And debugging also, because debugging is
Yes, that's one of my biggest concerns.
Yeah.
With reactive programming. Yeah. Awesome, great. Thank you so much, folks. Thank you so much, Monika.
Oh, no
We'll
problem.
see you.
And looking forward to seeing everyone.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have a great weekend.
Take good care and see you next Friday.
Yep. See ya. Take care.
Take care.
See you. Bye.